Okay, that was a nice pregnant pause, so I'll fill it by welcoming everybody to today's departmental seminar. It's fabulous to see so many people here, and there are people online as well. And of course, it's always lovely to gather on a Monday afternoon to hear latest science from a colleague, and even more so, I think, when it's one of our own, as we've got today, with Asifa joining us. So Asifa's been in the department for a couple of years, but the combination of joining us at the back end of COVID and then her year as a fellow at Harvard University means that I suspect some of you haven't yet met Asifa or got to learn about the richness of her work. So it's great that we get your talk early in Michaelmas term, Asifa, so we'll get to know you. But we'll do a tiny bit of background, and then we'll obviously leave most of the time for the talk. So Asifa started her academic career in Glasgow, and after an undergraduate degree and PhD there, spent, I think, 15, 17, 20 years, in some number of years in the Netherlands, a large number of years in the Netherlands, before coming back to the UK as a professor at the University of York for a few years, and then coming here, like I say, a couple of years ago. She's really well known for her work on psychology of language, and I think particularly a couple of aspects spring to mind when I think about Asifa's work. And one, if you look down her list of publications, it's a treat for the senses. There's papers there on language in connection with taste and smell and sound, and temporal and spatial properties of language, and how language and cultures come together in the course of communication. And I think a particularly welcome component of her work is the richness and diversity it brings, where she has really serious questions about universality by looking cross-culturally and cross-linguistically, but also moving away from the Anglocentrism that its focus of too much psycholinguistic work, and thinking about language in different writing systems, different language systems. And I think we're going to hear a bit about universality today. So Asifa, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Kate. Thanks all for coming. It's great to see so many people in real life, and I believe there's people virtually too. So I was asked to talk a little bit about my personal journey as part of the Athena Swan, and I'm just going to give you some personal tidbits along the way rather than show you a CV at the beginning of the talk. But when I was studying first at Glasgow, then at Edinburgh, I was really interested in understanding the mind. And of course, it's the heyday of cognitive science. And so when you think about what cognitive science is doing, what has brought the field of cognitive science into existence is a common research objective to discover the representational and computational capacities of the mind and their structural and functional representation in the brain. So for me, it's the mind rather than the brain that holds more fascination, but of course they come together. And a critical, important, influential voice at the time was Jerry Fodor, who argued that the heart of a cognitive science is its theory of concepts. And it's this research into concepts that's really shaped much of what I do. So we'll know from our prelim teaching tutorials that there's still much debate about the nature of conceptual representations. To what extent do they emerge from experience versus being built on some sort of building blocks that are innate and shared. And psychology has mostly addressed questions about the building blocks or empiricist perspective relying on infant studies, even though there's a different way to get into this, which is to take a cross-cultural perspective. That's been less influential in cognitive science into our understanding of the conceptual representation of the mind. And so for me, what I'm interested in is figuring out which aspects of our concepts are widespread across human cultures. So I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with the weird problem, the fact that most psychology studies are coming from a limited sample of people. This was famously articulated by Joe Henrich and colleagues. A couple of years before that, there was a paper published in American Psychologist that looked at the top psychology journals in the States and the samples and authors and editors of papers in those journals. So just to illustrate what Arnott found in his early work, if we take a world map and now plot it according to world populations, around 8 million people in the world right now, we can see that Europe is actually a very small locus for human population. Africa, Asia are much bigger. But if we plot against that, what Arnett found in terms of the samples of participants in published psychology studies, we can see most of them are coming from North America, 14% from the UK, 13% from the rest of Europe, 3% from Asia, and hardly anything from other parts of the world. Now, Arnett's paper and Henrik and colleagues' paper caused quite a furore at the time. 10 years later, Arnett and colleagues looked again to see what had happened, and pretty much nothing has shifted. So North American psychology is perhaps a little bit less represented, but because we're getting more studies from the rest of Europe, so that's gone up to 15%. Asia has gone up slightly more, and by Asia I mean predominantly China and Japan contributing research here. That's gone up from 3% to 4%. So in the 10-year period between Arnett's initial paper and Henrik's paper and now, pretty much nothing has changed. In 2020, Clark Barrett looked at cognitive science papers, so now not narrowly restricting to the psychology journals that Arnett originally had, and found that most participants are still college students or from online communities, so that's been a shift in the field. Most cross-cultural studies compare USA and China, so that's been a shift. And interestingly, 53% of cross-cultural studies do include data from small-scale societies. So we've shifted to looking at quite traditional societies where there's people living in smaller ethno-linguistic communities, but not taking in, for example, large agriculturalist or kind of shifting to industrial societies. That's still a massive gap in what's going on. Now, for thinking about concepts, which I'm interested in, I think when I was growing up bilingually in Glasgow, with my other native language being Punjabi, it struck me as somewhat surprising that the concepts that cognitive scientists were interested in were those that were easily lexicalized in English. So not all of them seem to map directly to the other language that I spoke. So isn't it interesting that the units of the mind are those that correspond to English words and not ones that correspond to Punjabi words or other languages? And it was this realization that sparked my interest in going to the Netherlands, where at the time there was a Max Planck Institute that had a department dedicated to understanding cross-linguistic diversity. And so I joined that department, and over 17 years, we investigated various semantic domains for how conceptual categories were cut up. And of course, I won't be able to talk about all of those today, so I've just pulled out a few different case studies to illustrate some general methodological points I wanted to make today. So first, just an observation that English is one of 7,000 languages spoken today. One language goes extinct every 3 months, and the rate is accelerating. 50% of languages will be extinct or seriously endangered by the end of this century. And interestingly, sadly, 40% of languages are still underdescribed today, or undescribed completely. Can I just check that there's another screen that's on here? I don't know if that's affecting the online audience, so I can see the online audience. Got it. Sorry, small technical. Okay, so you can see that in terms of our knowledge about what's possible in the world's languages, we haven't sampled all the variation that there is. And that's important, and one way that we can see that that's important if you care about application is that language extinction triggers a loss of unique medicinal knowledge. So a very nice paper showed that for every small-scale language that was lost, there was unique information about plants that were lost that were related to different healing properties. More generally, we know that English is an outlier in terms of its grammar, its morphology, its phonology, its syntax, and I would say in its concepts too, when we compare it to what we do know about linguistic diversity. So that's led me and some of my colleagues to kind of take stock of what it is that we know. And our maybe radical claim is that over-reliance on English has led to premature claims of universality due to oversampling of English speakers. That's been well documented. But also it's limited the cognitive constructs being examined by cognitive scientists due to the use of English as a meta-language. And I wanted to draw attention to another fact, that it's not just that we're not doing research on these languages, it's when we do research, nobody seems to care. So weird countries, including the United States, mention the samples country in their titles less often than articles from non-weird countries. But mentioning the name of the samples country actually leads to less citations for papers unless you refer to the US. And when you look at what students do, when a student is looking for information, going to Google Scholar, trying to figure out what papers are relevant, what you can see is that American students, when they're choosing what papers to read, will choose a paper that has a US in the title more than any other. But this also seems to lead to German students not choosing, preferring to choose papers that don't have the country or ethnic origin of the samples in their titles either. So the problem isn't just what we're doing, but how we value cross-cultural research in our general research endeavors. I'd say that each language is interesting to look at because it encapsulates a system of knowledge within a specific cultural context, and that going beyond English, both as an object of inquiry and as a tool for investigation, is necessary to decolonize the mind, to draw attention to where we're going wrong in our thinking about the mind. And so that's why in my research program, as Kate said, I take diversity seriously. And one of the things that I've been thinking about over the last few years is, well, how exactly do we do this in better ways? So if we know that the classic way of sampling humans, if we want to generalize, I think most of us who are interested in theorizing about the mind want to generalize to all humans, but the classic way that we sample humans is take one language group, let's say English, or one cultural group, and just sample from that. So class non-comparative sampling has been the way. More recently, as people are trying to engage with diversity, the way to do that is through convenience sampling. So this is, for example, the use of online tools, which I think are very useful in some ways. But we have to recognize that when we use online tools, we're sampling a certain kind of person. These are people that are from a post-industrial or industrial society, that are technologically savvy, that are exposed to Western culture through film, TV, and education. They're mostly being usually undergraduates that are being sampled who are being educated in English language materials. So if we find a trait in an online diverse sample, and we find the same trait, there's not much we can conclude from that in terms of universals of the mind, I would say, because we can't tell whether that shared property is a function of something that's inherited versus something that you get from the shared environment. If we find differences, that's super interesting. So that means despite these shared environmental pressures, nonetheless, we're finding diversity. But if we find universal patterns, I think that's difficult to interpret with respect to what's is shared infrastructure versus learned traits. We could go a bit, use a different strategy instead, which is try to use numerically representative sampling. So let's say that there's 7,000 or so ethno-linguistic groups. Let's take that as our unit of interest. We know that not all cultures and languages are equally big, so we have some very large languages like English or Mandarin, Arabic, but lots of many small ones. So we could say, okay, let's just try and scale up in a good way, and we'll just focus on the major cultural units, and we'll try to sample more representatively from there. That would get us some purchase. And what I've been advocating for is something slightly different, which is theory-based sampling. Let's engage with what we know about cultural diversity. Anthropologists have been building databases of cultural features for centuries. Let's use that to guide our sampling in ways that can be most meaningful for us as psychologists. So for example, I have been thinking about smell quite a lot. And in smell, there's a huge argument about whether there's shared preferences in smells or whether this is something that's culturally relative. So if I was interested in testing these theories, then it would make sense for me to sample cultures from different smellscapes, coastal, forest, urban, with people living different kinds of lifestyles, maybe a hunter-gatherer or an urban lifestyle. And that's what we did in a study that we published last year. So we took a sample of 10 cultures from different physical environments and different cultural practices. And we were doing that to try and test this idea that there were culture-specific smells guiding our preferences. So we all know of different cultures where they prefer foods that seem completely disgusting to us. And that's led anthropologists to suggest that cultural practices are very important for determining what our odour preferences are. They're completely relative. So I might like, I don't know, what do I like? Something that you don't like. And so, you know, because culture is shipping it. Thank you. On the other hand, we have studies with neonates suggesting that they already have preferences as soon as they're born. So there's some odours that they find pleasant and others that they turn away in disgust at. And this video illustrates that very nicely, I think. So that suggests that maybe there is already some preparedness for liking or disliking certain odours. And consistent with that, there's findings that suggest that we can predict the pleasantness of an odour from molecular features of that odorant. So in one study, Keller and colleagues looked at 476 different molecules. They got ratings from around 50 people who rated these odours for pleasantness. And what they found was that the pleasantness of the molecules could be predicted based on their chemical features. And so we took this database and we sampled 10 odours from that database. So sampled across odour space. We did a really simple task. We took the odorants, we put them in these marker pens. So they're like pens that you can write on a whiteboard. Instead of an ink, we put an odorant inside of it. And we took the 10 odours, put them in the pens, and we gave them to people, and we just said, put these in order from the one that smells the nicest to you to the one that smells the worst. So rank order task, so they can smell the odours as much as they want, and they just put them in order. So this is a task that we can use with people from very different backgrounds. Some of the people that we test in our study come from non-literate communities. They're not used to standardized testing, and so this simple paradigm works in the different cultural contexts that we're looking at. And what we found was that, in fact, there were shared preferences in which odours were pleasant or unpleasant. So around 40% of odour preference judgments could be predicted based on the molecular features of the odorant. There was a lot of individual variation, but culture only predicted 6% of the variance. So that was surprising to me. It's not what I expected to find. And in fact, you could go further. You could show that you could take any individual from within one culture, the same culture, and look at how strongly they correlated with one another compared to how they correlated with people from different cultures. And there were you could use other cultures, individuals, to predict the preferences of somebody from a different culture as well. Does that make sense? Yeah. And you can model this, model the preference judgments computationally and show that individual preferences can be modeled from the computational algorithm as well, based on just molecular features. So what our study suggests is that the perception of odour pleasantness is not culturally relative, and that there is a shared universal bedrock of perception. So I'm confident now, despite what I predicted, that there is a universal basis to odour preferences. Now, we used theoretical predictions, theoretical, culturally relevant theoretical variation to sample our culture so we can make the strongest generalizations about universals. But these wouldn't be relevant if you were interested in a different kind of phenomena. So let's say you're interested in theory of mind. It doesn't make sense for you to focus on smellscapes or hunter-gatherers really then in that context. Instead, you might start thinking about other phenomena like the social networks of individuals. Maybe aspects of language would be important. So it's been suggested that mental state vocabulary predicts theory of mind. their very syntactic structures are precursors for being able to do theory of mind. So you can take the extant variation, linguistic variation. We know that there's different mental state vocabulary cross-culturally. We know that there's different syntactic structures cross-culturally. We can use that to motivate and guide our cultural sampling so we can come to stronger conclusions about universals. Now, that's all great when we have some idea of what the relevant cultural theoretical dimensions are. What happens when we don't know? So we don't have a basis to build our theories at all. In that case, maybe we just need to take a random sample, a large random sample, to see what we find. So going back to concepts proper, we can look at event categories. So here, let's look at cutting and breaking events. So these are things like, let's see, this, or this. Okay, so these events are very simple. You think, well, why is that interesting? Well, these have been of interest to linguists and language acquisitionists because there seems to be a relationship between the semantics of these verbs and their syntactic behavior. So verbs like break seem to undergo certain grammatical alternations. So you can say, Sally broke the vase, and the vase broke. But you can't seem to do that with cut verbs. So you can say, Sally cut the carrot, but not the carrot cut. Sounds odd. And so people who are interested in language acquisition have suggested that there's a relationship between the meaning and the syntax, and either learning one or the other, depending on who you are, gives you the ability to break into the other thing. So either you think you come born with information about syntax, and so having that information allows you to learn the meaning of these words, or you think that you come with the semantics and then sort of help you get the syntax. But linguists, when they start talking about these concepts and what they mean, they give us definitions like this. So break means X caused Y to become broken, or a cut means X produced cut in Y by sharp edge coming into contact with Y. And as a psychologist, I would look at these and think, well, all the juicy stuff is in the things in red and blue. I have no idea what broken is, and I do what break is. So it's just not really helping me understand the meaning in a way that would be useful for me. You can come to it from a different perspective and say, okay, let's look at the referential meaning or the extensional meaning. So let's take different types of events of cutting and breaking and ask people just to describe them. And we're going to take their descriptions as an indication of what the meanings of these different terms are. So we did this in a broad cross-cultural sample. So we sampled quite a lot of languages from the Indo-European language family because there was a bit of convenience attached here, but we also took many other languages from smaller languages unrelated to one another from different parts of the world. And we just asked people to describe these different scenes. And what we did was we took the verbs from each language and just plot them across the different scene types. Now, it doesn't matter what the verbs actually are. What we're going to do, so we're not going to compare directly the forms with one another. We're going to use the verbs to create similarity matrices. So what we're going to say is for any two scenes, if they share a verb, whatever that is, within a language, that's a similar scene. And if they don't share a verb, that's a different scene. Once we do that, we get for each language a similarity matrix that we can now analyze in a bunch of different ways, including various data reduction techniques. Here, this is a correspondence analysis just of the events themselves. So the numbers refer to different video clips. And what we could show was that there was a small dimensional space that accounted for the way that different languages categorized cutting and breaking events. So in this first dimension, people were describing events of cutting, so finely slicing a carrot, differently to events of breaking, for example, snapping a twig. Whereas things like karate chopping a carrot was somewhere in between. So for some languages, they would categorize this as a cut event, whereas other languages would categorize this as a break event. The second dimension that explained the variance in the data was separated out tearing events from everything else. And then the third dimension distinguished different types of breaking events, so snapping events versus smashing events. So if we take this dimensional space, so just looking at the first and second dimension, we can see that languages pull out different events for categorization in different verbs. So this is English. It has two very broad verbs, cut and break. There are many subtypes of different manners of doing cutting, so slice, snip, and so forth, but cut is a higher order verb. But if you look at Dutch, which is closely related, even at the basic level, it's categorizing these events in quite a different way. So even within cut, for example, you can see that there's a distinction that isn't made in English. So for English, if you look up cut in Google Images, you can see that cutting with scissors is there just as slicing with a pair of scissors, slicing with a knife is. But in Dutch, actually, the translation equivalent, the word-to-word equivalent, isn't exactly referentially the same. So the translation equivalent of cut in Dutch is snijden, which means to cut with a single blade. If you're cutting with a double-bladed object, that's knippen. It's a completely different verb. So it's not a subtype, it's at the same level. So you're finding very different categorization patterns. And if we go beyond the Indo-European languages, we also find counter-evidence for the idea that the semantics and the syntax go together for these sorts of verbs. So in Srenan, for example, there's, this is a Creole-based lexicon language. You can see that koti, which is similar to English cut, can in fact appear in the alternation that English can. So you can do the equivalent of the cloth cut in this language, which you're not able to do in English. So we're getting some insight into the semantic or conceptual variation and the fact that there seems to be some complications here about the relationship between concepts and syntax. We can also use the data that we get to look not just at how the concepts have been categorized, but how similar the languages are to one another, using the same kind of approach. And here, if we do this, we can see along the x-axis, this is picking up what we can call the universal structure. So the closer to 1 on this map, the more similar the languages are. On the second dimension, you start putting out variation. So overall, the languages seem to be categorizing things in similar dimensional space, apart from one language that seemed to be an outlier, which is Japanese. So it didn't show a strong correlation with the other languages. And that kind of puzzled me at the time. It wasn't clear from the data that we had whether this was a problem with the way the study was run, or whether this was a deep fact about Japanese doing something very different. So a few years later, I had a PhD student, John Houseman, who did fieldwork on the Japonic language family, so Japanese, and then a number of the Ryukyuan languages that are related to Japanese, and was able to collect similar data. And he found that, in fact, the categories in Japanese and the other Ryukyuan languages were similar in many respects and seemed to obey the same dimensional structure that we originally found, and was able to compare this to Germanic languages that have about the same time depth as the Japonic languages do. And overall, he found that there was, in fact, a strong relationship, reasonable relationship in the semantic categories of cutting and breaking between Japonic and Germanic. So they are more similar to each other than you would expect by chance. But within language families, there's more similarity. So within Germanic, there's more similarity in their semantic categories, and within the Japonic languages, there's more similarity within the language families. So that tells us two things here. One, there is a shared dimensional structure, well, three things. There's a shared dimensional structure, not the exact categories mapping onto one another, but some constraints in how the space is carved up. That's shared across different language families, but there's also specific dynamics within each language family that we need to understand, and we don't have good models of explaining at the moment. Okay, so that's one study where we could take a cross-cultural sample, try to take 28 different languages from different parts of the world, different language families, and try and extrapolate shared conceptual structure. Sometimes when you take this diverse approach, you don't find universals at all. So in more recent work, I've been thinking about the language of perception. And it's been claimed that there's a hierarchy of perception, that humans are really visual creatures. are a third or half of the brain is devoted to vision, but the smell and taste really aren't important in our mental lives. It's been claimed that we don't have words to talk about smells, it's difficult to remember smells accurately, it's difficult to imagine smells at will, and so forth. So it's been claimed that these aren't important senses, whereas vision and audition, clearly, because we primarily seem to use the auditory modality to speak in languages where both modalities are available, in communities where both modalities are available, that these are perhaps more important. And one corollary of that is that you might expect more conceptual elaboration, more words for visual things and auditory things than you would for touch, taste, and smell, and more agreement, more consensus in how we talk about visual and auditory phenomena than the other senses. So to test that, we took a number of different stimuli, sampled colors from one cell space, shapes for good and poor gestalt forms, sounds that varied in pitch, loudness, and tempo, tactile textures, beautiful furry and spiky things to touch while you're blindfolded, taste, sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami, and smells of various types. And people just experience these sensory stimuli one at a time, and they had to describe them. That's all. They just describe them. And we collect data from 20 different languages. So again, trying to take a diverse sample as possible. There's some big languages like English and Cantonese, many smaller languages like Umpala, which is now essentially a sleeping language, so there aren't speakers of this language anymore. There were 3 sign languages: British Sign Language, Katakalok, and American Sign Language. So Katakalok is a village sign that's only emerged in the last 3 or 4 generations. Collaborators who were experts in these languages took these sensory stimuli to the field and then collected data in the native language of each participant. So participants were asked in their own language, what's this color, what's this shape, what's this smell, and so forth. And then we looked to see how much agreement there is in naming those stimuli. So if there's a universal hierarchy of the senses, you'd expect visual stimuli to be named with high agreement, followed by sound, touch, taste, and smell to show low agreement. So what I'm going to do is take, for every sensory stimulus that we took, the average agreement per modality, and plot that on a scale from 0 to 1, where 1 would mean complete 100% agreement in the naming, and 0 would mean every single person within that community gave a completely different response for that stimulus, that on average over all of the stimuli that we tested. What we find is that for English speakers, their relative hierarchy of the senses is as predicted. So actually it statistically matches the predicted hierarchy better than chance. But English is the only language out of the 20 languages that does that. So for the 20 communities that we tested, there's 13 different rank orders of the senses. So for English, well, color showed the highest agreement. For Dogodom and Cebu, touch showed the highest agreement, whereas Umpala smell showed the highest relative ranking of the senses. Now that's interesting because it's claimed, like I said, that in none of the world's languages is there a classification of smells. There's no semantic field of smells. And this large-scale cross-cultural study actually brought to my attention one community, the Jahai, who are a group of mobile subsistence foragers that live in the Malay Peninsula. They still live a relatively traditional lifestyle, so there's some pressures to try and get people to settle now, but the Jahai still live in forests, still are primarily foraging for food. And my colleague Nicholas Bernhoff has been doing long-term documentation of the language and the culture there, came back from the field knowing that we were doing this large-scale study and said, oh, the Jahai have smell words. And I was like, no, they don't. He's like, no, they do, they really do. And so he came back with this material and he was showing it to me, and he was telling me about all of these smell words in the community, and I had no idea what he was talking about. So he was trying to describe these things to me, and it just didn't make any sense. And so he persuaded me that I should start doing field work. So up until this point, I had been designing studies that my collaborators were running in the field and coming back with data, and I would sit there and do my analysis. It's all great. So I started going to the jungle, which I have to say is not easy. So running participants in tropical conditions while there's bitey things is much harder than doing it in the lab here. But what we found over a number of field trips was that the Jahai did indeed have a dedicated lexicon of different types of smells. So these were things like zadput, so it's the smell of flowers, durian, so this bear cat that smells like popcorn, janges, which is the smell of like smoky things, this wild ginger, centipede, bat cave, bat droppings. It's different to Hayek smells, which is associated with the smell of tiger, shrimp paste, tree sap, very different kind of unpleasant smells. So there's around a dozen different terms. And when we test the Jahai under experimental conditions, we find that they're using this vocabulary to describe even novel smells. So in this video, you'll see my hand coming in from the side with a sniffing pen that I introduced you to earlier. And the Jahai participant here will name it. So I think the audio doesn't seem to be working on this, but you'll see his mouth move and you'll see a subtitle. So hopefully that will give you a sense of what's going on. So here we are. Number 2. Is this now? Okay, so he gets a smell and he gives a response fairly fast. You'll see it's fairly fast when I compare this to another participant with the same odor. This is a Dutch participant. I'm sorry the audio didn't come across, but you get the idea. So across participants and odors, you can see the Jahai are basically using one strategy. They use one of their smell verbs every single time to describe these odors, whereas the Dutch participants are doing all sorts of different things. So they refer to a source, often like cinnamon. Sometimes they'll refer to a specific episode. Oh, it's like my granny's house. Sometimes they'll use a multimodal description. It smells green or purple or whatever. So many different strategies. And if we look at the timing, so across the x-axis here we have our participants, so 30 Jahai participants, 30 Dutch participants. With the amount of time it takes them to name an odor, you can see on average Jahai participants take 2 seconds to come up with a description for a smell, and Dutch participants take 13 seconds to say, I don't know. If you wait until they give you a contentful description, it's about 30 seconds on average before they're able to name an odor. So having these lexical resources, these different words to describe different types of smells, means these things are more salient in mind, and people are able to name novel odors in a way that's much more fluent and fluid than our Dutch participants are able to do, or English participants in other studies. And going back to the point that I started with, that the fact that we have this vocabulary in Jahai but not English, I think really draws attention to the fact that we can't take for granted that what there is in language is a direct reflection of what there is in mind. So without non-linguistic studies to establish whether these categories are available to non-Jahai speakers, perhaps they're there and we just haven't tapped into them, or perhaps language is really creating these concepts de novo in different cultural contexts, and then we have to think about, reflect on what English is doing for us in creating the concepts that we think we're operating with as a default. So I've shown a few different studies, we've done many different things. I wanted to just kind of make everyone sit a little bit with the idea that we have to be mindful of the generalizations that we make based on the types of sampling, cultural sampling that we're doing. So if we think that the heart of a cognitive science is really its theory of concepts, then we need to start taking diversity more seriously. Thank you.
very much, Asifa. As predicted, that was really fascinating talk, and I think really illustrates how lucky we are to have her in the department, and not just here in the department in psychology and neuroscience, but also such a wonderful opportunity to make links with our colleagues in social sciences and humanities. And I hope there are people from other departments and divisions who are able to either be at your talk today or catch up with you soon. I think it's definitely something that we can really build on in the department. So we've got time for questions as usual. We'll be particularly inviting questions from students and early career academics to start with. We'll also keep an eye online if we may, Anne-Marie, to see if there's any questions there, but over to you. Yes.
In the study that you said about how German students were less likely to pick studies with was the implication that that was because there were fewer citations or because of the country's name being?
Oh, that's a great question. I think in the experimentals, there's two different pieces of information. So one was the authors just looked at citation practices amongst academics. And then in the study, I don't believe the students were given citation information, so they didn't have that. So it's purely based on the title information itself. But I guess in real life, you have access to both if you are using Google Scholar or something. If you think a paper is more important because it's cited more, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, then you're going to just reinforce those biases.
I think there's a question. Thank you, yes.
In the first study, the smell study, I was wondering what the different scents were that you used. I was wondering if for some countries there might be more specific scents that people are used to, and if that might have also influenced the results.
Yeah, yes. That could indicate the case. So these are the orders that we used. So the nicest order, so this got quite a lot of press coverage, and somehow the Daily Mail took this to mean that vanilla is the most pleasant smell in the world. So it's the most pleasant smell out of the ones that we sampled. So isovaleric acid is something that's in cheese, but also in fruit sweat. So yes. But I think the broader question of like, would we get a different result if we sampled odors differently is an open one. So I would say the answer is no, you wouldn't get a different result because of the way that we sampled the odors in the first place, based on this study. So based on the results of this study. So we took 10 odors that were maximally distant from one another from this larger 480 odd set of odors. And out of that broader set, you could predict the pleasantness of the odor based on their chemical properties. And since then, DeepMind have been doing a collaboration with a couple of my collaborators on this, and they've expanded out the odorants that they're looking at, and they seem to be able to predict the pleasantness based on judgments from Western participants. But since our cross-cultural study seems to show a similar pattern, I think it's likely that it does hold, but it would be good to have converging evidence. Yeah.
Yes, please.
In the slide where you showed 4 different sampling strategies, you were saying that you were advocating for the bottom right one, right? The
Yes.
theory-based sampling. So wouldn't that encourage biases, perhaps, that are based on theory? So to me, I would advocate for perhaps a balance between C and D, rather than just D, but what would your perspective be?
So I'm advocating for D on the basis that for many phenomena that psychologists are interested in, they actually do have there's enough work that they have some idea of what parameters might be of relevance, so like theory of mind, for example, where the anthropological and linguistic fields have something to tell us about their variation. So you could make good use of the knowledge that we have across fields to make motivated sampling decisions. So I think that's better. In a case where you don't really know what the relevant conceptual basis for variation might be, perhaps numerically representative sampling is a good first step. But you're going to miss that. So what we seem to find in terms of conceptual structures is you find the most interesting things in the communities that are the most different. And so that will typically be smaller scale societies with a different lifestyle, so not engaged in technologies in the same way, for example. So that's where my interest lies, but I can see for other sorts of questions, there might be a different motivated strategy. So let's say you're interested in mental health and well-being on screen time, then it would be good to look at other large cultures that are also engaged in the same thing, but now sampling in a numerically representative way.
I'm now going to increase the category and invite anybody to ask a question. I'm going to go to Gaia first because she's been sitting on the floor. So, and then it's almost a hand there, yeah. So Gaia first and then everyone.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed that. Lots of beautiful thought. And we've been thinking about theory-based sampling. I was really intrigued by within language expertise as a potential dimension for deep sampling, and also by multilingualism as a dimension itself. So I mean, and this all comes from walking alongside my husband, who's an English speaker. I'm a bilingual, but not fluent to speak. Although I've spoken English for a very long time, and finding there was one word that he could not translate from Italian into English of a sound. And we talked about this, and he said, oh, maybe we should ask a marina or somebody who lives on a ship or somebody who lives by the sea to tell you, and it probably would have a word that translates into my Italian risata. So the experience and within language, but as well as multilingualism.
Yeah. So I have thought of this. So I've done a bunch of work with wine experts. So we looked at when I started working with the Jahai. Initially, psychologists, were skeptical. I think, were like, could this really be the case? These exotic folks. How reliable is this? So we had to kind of get a number of lines of evidence together to show that there was really something systematically different going on. And then there was a kind of like 180 flip where people were like, well, this isn't so special. It's just what wine experts do. I don't know why you think this is so special. So we started looking at wine experts. So we looked at their descriptions of the smells and tastes of wine in wine reviews. So using an NLP type approach to see, could we predict features of the wine from the description? So could we tell whether it was a red or a white wine? Could we tell what grape it was? Could we tell what vineyard and year and so forth? And we could, better than chance. We did blind tasting with wine and coffee experts. We could show that the wine experts were able to name the smells and tastes of wine better than the coffee experts and lay people, but only the wine smells and tastes, not coffee smells and tastes, and not everyday common smells and tastes. So it was something that was very specific. And then we went on to look at their memory and imagery, and again we found that their memory and imagery for wines was better than lay people, but only for wines. So again, it doesn't generalize. So a couple of things. So one, I think this is a really useful strategy to look at, especially if you're interested in some of the mechanistic ways that language might be building these categories. But there's also something different going on. So what we find with the wine experts is the strategies that they're using are not substantively different to what we find in lay people vocabulary. So they're still using source-based descriptions. They're using some metaphor that we see incipiently in lay people's descriptions too, but just more standardized and more consensual. And it seems to be different to what we find in the cross-cultural data in that it's narrow expertise. So for the Jahai, I can take a novel odor that they've never experienced. I know they've not experienced because it doesn't exist in their natural environment, and they're able to apply one of their smell descriptors to it. Whereas the wine experts, their expertise seems to be really narrowly focused on what they've learned. So I don't know whether that's specific to wine experts. So like maybe if we looked at perfumers, would we find something different? Because there you can imagine you're engaging with a wider range of odorants, a different sort of game. So I think it's interesting to think about what characterizes that expertise. But it seems to me, and I would predict that what's happening in expertise is different to what's happening in the course of everyday learning of language.
So, sorry, hands here. This is what happens when we mention wine. For that, please, and then Jeff, I'll take your question. Jeff Bird online. You're coming soon, but question at the back first.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting talk. I was just wondering, why do you think the vast majority of societies really haven't developed a systematic classification system of smells, and the Jahai have? Is it when it's clearly from your studies seems quite beneficial in terms of reaction time, classification, accuracy? Do they use smell more within their indigenous environment, within these jungles and their environment? Do you think that's why they developed the system more?
Yeah, I was hoping I had another backup slide here, right, which I don't have. So it turns out that the Jahai, originally, 20 odd years ago, no, however long, some time ago, when we first did the studies with the Jahai, I thought they were unusual and English was a normal way of doing smells. I don't think that anymore. So in the last 10-15 years, there's been a number of studies with many different communities, and it looks like English and other Indo-European languages are unusual for not having a smell vocabulary. So we do find in a number of different places that experimentally there's communities that show better behavior in odor naming tasks under experimental conditions. And we also find the frequency of smell talk is more frequent in some other languages. So I think there's still a lot of scope for doing the experimental and corpus-based studies. So we do know that there's lexicons elsewhere in the world, but the experimental studies are still, a handful. So I think it'll be interesting to see how that fleshes out in the next few years. But I think there's two gaps where we don't seem to find olfactory vocabulary. One is in Europe and Northern Asia, so where the Indo-European languages are spoken, and the other seems to be Australia. But in both those cases, I don't know whether those are real gaps or because nobody's really looked there properly. So it's open, still, just have to see what happens, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm just going to read your question, Jeff, because we're not sure the sound is going to work, so I hope I'll do you justice. Presumably you can have a universal preference with it still being the case that those preferences are learned culturally, i.e. because all cultures avoid disease, smells, etc.
Yes, it's possible to have universals in the adult system that are learned universals because of shared environmental pressures. You'd need infant data to be able to distinguish those cases. And in fact, there's very nice work from Benoit Charles' lab where he assigned pregnant women into different conditions. So in the last trimester of the pregnancy, one group of women were told to eat aniseed, but not garlic. And the other group were told to eat garlic, not aniseed. And then the newborn infants were tested for the odor preferences, and they showed preferences aligned with the maternal diet. So that means that the chemical environment can be culturally shaped before birth. So yes, it's going to be tricky separating out those things for sure. But I think from my point of view, I'm interested in capturing universal properties regardless of whether you're born with them or whether they're coming from the environment.
I hope that's okay, Jeff, otherwise type furiously. Questions in the room. Matthew, then Jill, then Anne.
When you were showing the primacy of the different senses across different languages, it looked as if they were just random across different languages, but was there some structure to it? So do certain language families tend to have certain senses in particular orders, or particular lifestyles produce one sense as more primary than the other?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I don't have those backup slides either. So we sampled the communities to be unrelated from one another, so I can't answer the question about language relatedness. But we did separately develop an ethnographic questionnaire where we took what we knew from the anthropological cross-cultural research about relevant cultural properties that might predict the language variation. So it's been predicted that colour vocabulary can be predicted by having dyeing technology. So in a community with a simple dyeing community, like traditional Australian Aboriginal communities where you'd only use white and ochre, for example, you tend to have smaller colour lexicons, and then languages like English, where you dye everything, including my face right now, my clothes, the walls. You tend to get more elaborate colour lexicons. You might expect sound to be predicted by musical traditions or shapes by the existence of crafts like patterned leathering and pottery and so forth. So we took a bunch of these things, and you can predict the language variation based on various cultural features. Not all of them, but some of them in interesting ways. So, for example, if you if you have musicians in your culture, then everybody shows higher agreement in how we talk about sounds, not just the musicians. If you have a tradition of making patterned objects, then we show higher agreement in how you name shapes, but not colours. And if you live in rounded houses rather than square houses, you're better at naming rounded shapes than if you're not. So there's some things you can, but colour, for example, that didn't seem to predict anything. So dyeing technologies didn't predict colour naming. So I think the broader point is that it's possible to take these cultural predictors to look at language relationships, and in some cases they do align, in some cases they interestingly don't. And I think those cases can be particularly interesting for psychologists who are interested in non-linguistic aspects of the mind too, because where the language is telling you one thing and the culture is telling you something else, then you can maybe tease apart the contributions of both of them to see what's around what. So
Yeah, it was fascinating. It strikes me that you're trying to measure something about it's sort of very pure perceptual similarity, but that a lot of our conceptual knowledge might be context dependent or dependent on what we're going to do with the item. So, for example, you said about that chemical which the foot smell and in cheese, right? Now, so it seems to me it's difficult to ask someone a question without somehow even implicitly invoking that kind of context. So if you ask someone if that's a pleasant smell and you told them it was food, you might get a different answer from if you told them it was a non-food object. I guess I'm just wondering how you address that problem. Do you think it is a problem, or do you think the true truth is the underlying perceptual thing, or do you think, I guess as I do, that our concepts probably involve something to do with what we're going to do with the item?
There's a lot of very interesting different things that feed into your question. I think so in the odor pleasantness study, I think what I'm looking at there is perception, not conceptual structure. So I think the later studies were more clearly looking at concepts. So in the perception, I agree that there can be top-down effects. So there's studies that show modulation of odor preferences when you give a label. I think it's still unclear to what extent those are really changes in perception as opposed to higher order judgments. And nevertheless, I would say in the study that we're looking at, it does seem to be capturing something fundamental about the olfactory system. So there's separate evidence that people, just when they're given monomolecular odorants, behave in certain systematic ways to those odorants. So that's not to say that, like you said, that there are contextual modulations, but within the context of what we're looking at, I think we are tapping into perception proper. I think most of our actual real world mental life is very much contextually modulated. So any cross-cultural differences that we find, I think, are even more exacerbated under real world conditions. But within the constraints of this study, I think it's still surprising, shocking to me that we didn't find more cultural modulation of these preferences, given everything that we knew about cultural variation. So what I think is going on there is that actually overall, in terms of the olfactory space, there are shared preferences, but it can be the case within a culture that one or two specific odours are modulated one way or the other based on cultural understanding of that particular odour. So that's how you can take something that's fermented and kind of disgusting naturally and make it really nice, like the Swedish fermented fish, for example.
I know there are some more questions, but I'm also just aware time's moving on, so I think we should formally end now and just encourage people at Astro, if that's okay with you, to hang around if they've got more questions and more discussion afterwards. But thank you, Anne-Marie, for looking after us, and thank you, Esther.